I am not recording locally, just as point of order.
That's okay.
Fine. Yeah, that's
Okay,
fine.
cool.
It records for you on StreamYard,
I
which
thought
is
so.
why
Cool.
Yeah,
that's why we like to use this. But we are live.
It hasn't screwed up yet, I don't think, Chris, except, yeah, I don't think it's screwed up, right?
We've been
StreamYard
fine.
part.
Yeah. It's only when we've done stuff outside of StreamYard that things have ended up catastrophic.
Yeah. Rip some of those lost tapes.
What are you gonna
Out
do?
there in space, someone's listening to our dulcet tones talk about RPGs. Well, today we have someone else's dulcet tones. It's Adam Vass. Hey, Adam.
Hello. Hey.
Hey, what's up? We also have Aaron in the chat.
Aaron in the chat.
So
That's
what's
your
up,
new-
everybody?
That's your new name now. Yeah. Hey, what's up, everyone? Thanks for listening. The Brain Trust is here, says Aaron.
Nice.
But yeah, this is why we roll. It's the tabletop role playing game chat show. I guess we're still figuring that part out. I think. But yeah, we're here talking with Adam Voss. What else do we need to say? This is a production of Stillfleet Studio. If you like what you hear, if you like Stillfleet Studio and the many things that we produce, head on over to patreon.com/Stillfleet and just consider becoming a patron for like $3 a month, something like that. That helps us produce this show, also helps us produce all of the games that we're making out there. But anyway, hi, Adam.
Hello.
Hey. Adam, this is Wythe. Adam, we invited because we like his games and we saw him at a couple cons and said, why not? But we were just saying a couple themes have emerged, at least at the top of my brain. One is it's late September, almost spooky season, or it could be spooky season. It could be year round. If you're
I think it's I think it's early spooky season. Like I've already been watching horror movies consistently for the last month or so. So I feel like, I've been ramping up for myself.
Yeah, same, for sure.
But,
Same.
So I want to talk about, vampires, Satan, slashers, etc., ghosts,
All the good
exploring
stuff,
space. Yeah, all the stuff, Adam, you make games about. And then also graphic design. That was just another thing that Chris and I have admired from afar and said, who's really good at graphic design? And we both like graphic design and thought we could maybe ask about, how do you make your books? So those are just two random things that I wanted to throw out there. But Adam, before we get into it, do you want to let people know a little about yourself, introduce yourself?
Yeah, who's Adam Voss?
Yeah, my name is Adam. I live in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I am a full-time musician and full-time tabletop RPG designer and publisher. I am probably most well known for my stoner metal science fantasy weird gonzo game Necronautilus, and also co-designed This Discord Has Ghosts in It with Will Yobst.
Very fun.
And then there's so many more other games that are probably less well known, but those are my. If you might have heard those in passing.
Yeah, I was gonna say a theme that's carried over from our conversation last week with Spencer Campbell. These won't be released in that order, but listeners, imagine in your mind that we're recording outside of time and space. But yeah, last week we were talking to Spencer Campbell, and we were just saying it's like, oh my god, you were an incredibly prolific writer and designer, and it's like you're just kind of popping off all the time. And I have the same sense about you and your process for creating games. Like I think I have 4 or 5 of your physical games, and then on top of that, you've got a huge library on itch. It's there's a lot out there.
I think Spencer and I both have a hard time letting an idea stay an idea.
Yeah.
And both like to see it to fruition. And to me, that's getting it in print and having something that I can hold. So, I have a lot of zines. I have a lot of books, a lot of box sets. I just had to get a storage unit so that I could get some of it out of my home.
Wow.
But
nice.
Yeah, got a lot of games. I for a while was putting out a game every month through Patreon, and all of them were in print. And then on top of that, doing maybe 3 or 4 like tentpole sized projects a year, but just could not. I did that for 3 or 4 years, and that was a lot. And it was fun, but that was also, I mentioned I'm a full-time musician. when quarantine started and I couldn't tour, I went all in with game stuff. And since I wasn't on the road, I had a lot more time than I knew what to do with. So I could turn all of those ideas into projects, and built up a pretty big library very quickly.
Nice. Well, I think that leads into our traditional second question, which it sounds like, your game work predates COVID, right? So how'd you get into games? What was the first game? How did you get started down the path of eventually going pro?
Well, in 2016-ish, my friend group all worked at the comic book and board game store in town. And so we would hang out almost every day and play something. Usually it was like, is this game worth carrying in the store? Or, this company sent us something to check out or like cross promote or whatever. So I didn't work there, but by proxy, I was doing all the testing and playing, and just like I was an additional player of those games. So I got thrown in the deep end of like modern boutique strategy stuff. From that, it was still probably a year before I played Dungeons and Dragons 3.5 for my first role-playing game experience. And I think I had that moment that a lot of people have, like coming from strategy gaming, and especially with that version of Dungeons and Dragons where it was like very rigid and very by the rules. That the second you get into this like freedom space to be creative and to like riff with each other, I was like, oh, this is something else. Like, this isn't about winning and losing in a game. This is like telling stories and being something, and like that, exploring all kinds of can I curse? All kinds of shit.
Yeah, you're gonna curse.
So then immediately too, I have always been someone of like, if I like something, I want to know everything about it and like how it works, and kind of have that analytical brain. So from Dungeons and Dragons 3.5 to saying like, why is this, how is this like fun? How is this making me feel that creative spark? And then wanting to say like, and I never really was a fantasy person, so that was not my bag to begin with, D&D. Wanted to do other weird stuff in that world. So from there, I went really quickly into indie RPG stuff. Fiasco was another game that I played in my first year of exploring these things that really kind of changed how my brain was wired. And so, I went from playing board games with the employees of the store with my friend group to publishing my first RPG zine in like a year. And that was the first edition of Babes in the Wood, which is my PBTA game that's kind of like Over the Garden Wall, the cartoon.
Yeah.
That was my first sort of like, I want to play in this world and like be one of these characters, but I have to build it. And then really enjoyed that process, and it was just out of control after that.
Nice. Yeah. So it's interesting. We've talked to a few people who like didn't start with D&D, which I'm always excited by, and or play D&D, and then we're like, nah, I get this. I'm hold my beer. I'm going to go do my own thing. So I really like what you're saying about kind of almost designing as a reaction to your experience with D&D, which I think for those of us who grew up playing D&D as kids, that is also the case. It just took a lot longer to feel empowered to make that shift.
I think you're more, when you start younger, you're more entrenched in it, and you're like, oh, this is the thing that you do, and this, and But coming into it when you're a little bit older. Yeah, because my question was going to be, how do you get from like the kind of rigid wargaminess of 3.5, which, also, third edition was my first foray into that. But like, how do you get to that from that to Necronautilus, where it's like you're going from traditional murder hobo into disembodied soul connected to, I forget exactly what it is. You'll have to explain Necronautilus for those who don't know.
Necronautilus, you play as souls that have died and are bound to toxic gas clouds in this ever-expanding universe that is the afterlife of everything. So like every alien civilization and everything that's ever happened that has died exists somewhere in this universe, and your players go and explore those places and meet those people who are also like undead souls, but you have been stripped of like kind of your individualism and your like identity, and through play you either lean into that sort of totalitarian duty or kind of explore what that identity was and recontextualize it and try to figure out like who you are and who you want to be. So yeah, it's a little lofty, but it's also in the wrappings of an adventure game. Like at the heart of it, you're still rolling dice to overcome big things that want to destroy you. But yeah, that bridge to me is not super far. Because I do think immediately my first play of Dungeons and Dragons was storming this pirate ship, and it was extremely tactical, and it was like, you know, this many squares on the ship, and how do you scale the side of the ship? Like, do you have a rope with a hook on the end or whatever? Like, very rigid. And I'm like, okay, this is just like any board game I've ever played. And it's fine. But again, since I wasn't a fantasy head, I was like not really getting anything out of it. And then the battle ends and I'm like at the top of the ship with the captain, the person who we're trying to like stop. And I'm like, okay, I want to like destroy him. Like I want to kill him. And the dungeon master was like, okay, well, how do you want to do it? What do you want to do? And I was like, wait, I don't have to like, you know, hit X to jump. Like I can just come up with my own stuff. And that right there was the drug for me of like, I'll lose all the tactics. I'll lose all the fantasy and the elves and the magic. And I just want that experience of making stuff up, of being imaginative and having no limits. And so Necronautilus was very much a response to that, in that there's no like power limit because you can do anything you want. The way that you engage with that mechanically is you're collecting and recontextualizing the language that you know through play. So your powers, instead of strength, dexterity, whatever, they're just words that you come across. And anytime you can come up with a use or a definition or stretch it like into wordplay and weird stuff like that, you can try, and then the dice will just tell you how good or bad the result is, or I guess how close to your intention it is. And that then leads to its own type of storytelling. And it was a story that felt more like the kind of stuff that I would watch and the kind of stuff that I would want to play, that was a response to, but a kind of deliberate, not ignoring, but subversion, I guess, of just sort of like fantasy role playing.
Yeah. It's like, what is the source of the fantasy? Is fantasy you're living out some like version of a Celtic myth cycle, badly interpreted by Victorians, whatever, updated by Tolkien, updated by Gygax, whatever, or are you living out a different kind of fantasy? And I think at heart, all speculative fiction, I mean, there's some sort of novums, there's some sort of what if. So I like sci-fi for a number of reasons. And I think even horror, if you're not doing super realist slasher modern horror, but some other, there's a ghost, there's a spirit, you know, then there's also a what if there, and you can play around with like intermixing, you know, mixing with the faders on those. So I think Necronautilus is cool for a number of reasons, because it has a bit of a sci-fi vibe to me, but also it feels horrific, but not in a scary way. It feels like it's dealing with death. I mean, it's all about death, but it's almost more like a weird mourning ritual. You know, it doesn't feel like it's about sort of killing. It's more about acknowledging entropy in this very cosmic, you know, more like we've talked about, I think before on the show, but called philosophique. So the genre of the thought experiment. So less hard sci-fi or like horror in the traditional sense or science horror, but more this kind of weird what if space that I think is really fruitful for game design. But obviously the 99% of games are like Celtic myth cycles, elves, whatever. So it's cool. It's cool to see that game took off. And I also will say, I mean, I'm a big fan of cyber metal, which is not exactly the same genre, but has some of that blending. It feels like of genre. So it feels like a lot of your work is like, there's elements of sci-fi, there's definitely elements of horror, but I don't know that it's reducible to sort of any one simple.
Yeah.
Oh, I've seen that before.
I was gonna say Necronautilus always is like soft or gentle. I think gentle is a better word. It's gentle cosmic horror. It's like you're still confronting the vastness of the universe and everything that lies beyond death. But it's chill. It's not as it's not like a Lovecraftian thing where the color purple is going to drive you mad or something like that. It's a little bit more evenly paced out.
Yeah, I think both of what you said is true. Is that like a lot of my games are putting X, Y, and Z influences into a blender and hoping that the thing that comes out is more than the sum of its parts. Because even cyber metal, which is like my philosophy injected into cyberpunk, doesn't like, it has some cyberpunk trappings, but it's almost, I like to think it's somewhere outside of that milieu that is its own thing and saying its own themes, and it's in conversation with other cyberpunk role-playing, but it is trying to have a different conversation.
Well, even the name implies that, right? There's an adjacency to cyberpunk, but it's not punk, it's metal, and it's like we can nitpick, but there's differences, but there's similarities between genre.
And this maybe brings up the... go ahead, Chris. I had a thought, but it's taking us in another direction. So,
well, I was just going to ask. I mean, you do jump around in genre a lot, and you play with genre a lot. Mechanically or like systems wise, do you find that you have like kind of similar things that you come back to over and over again? Is there like a through line mechanically through the games, or is it kind of like custom fit for each thought experiment that we're going for?
I love designing systems, which is my blessing and curse. That every game I design for the most part has its own unique system, so it makes it a little bit harder to pitch and harder to convince people to give it a try and learn something new. But I think that they are very curated for the type of experience that I want you to have within that world. Because even just those two games as an example, like Necronautilus is it's a power fantasy in that you can do anything, but it's also got this dose of humility when the things that you want don't happen the way that you expect them to, versus cyber metal, which is a D100 system. You roll under your stat to try to do something, but then you split that 100 into its 2d10 like component dice, and one of them is how much damage you do and the other is how much fallout happens. So every time you roll, you get to decide if things are getting better or worse depending on how much damage you either want to inflict or take back on you. So it takes that sort of Blades in the Dark conversational speed bump, I would call it, of position and effect, turns it into the dice roll itself, and then lets the player choose between ostensibly two outcomes that are polar from one another. So that game is really meant to say, like, this world will beat you up. It is a very like political game in that we are on the ground citizens in this city that don't have political power beyond our block, and everything out there wants you dead. So like, it's very reactionary. It's very like metal and punk in that like counterculture type of way. So yeah, they use different dice and different math to emphasize those themes, so that whether you're paying attention to them or not while you play, because I think this is kind of my bread and butter and the thing that I want all my games to be like. If you want to engage with this game in that political mindedness or philosophical mind, you can, But if you want to just roll dice and do crazy shit, you can. And like, that's a spectrum, obviously. You can play anywhere on that spectrum. But I don't want someone to not have a good time. I mean, I think there are games that are less fun and more politically vocal, and I don't think that's a bad thing. And then obviously the inverse is true as well, like games that are just pure escapist. I want that to be kind of a player-facing option in my games. And so I tend to think of the system to either be like buttered up so that you have that mental space to think about those things, or to be cumbersome enough that you have to engage with it in a mechanical way, like that cyber metal, making that decision every time you roll, because you're thinking about how this is going to affect the people around you and not just you every time you roll. So I want to hammer home that theme mechanically.
Yeah, and that creates, like you said, it's a much more conversational tone at that point, right? Where it's like you're literally having to negotiate with the people at the table. It's like, well, what is actually the best thing for us, or like, do I just make the choice to have a funny moment, things like that? But I like that. I like that openness and negotiation that encourages.
Yeah, it's giving people the hooks. I mean, it's something we strive for in our games as well, where you can play them and just play them in a picaresque mode, murder hobo mode. But you can also have a political mode where the thing you're being asked to do has some political effect, good or bad. And so by being asked to do it or forced to do it or whatever, sort of like you're saying, that this sort of block by block, like contestation of urban space or whatever, however you want to summarize kind of the narrative structure of cyber metal, but like the way that factions are doing cyberpunk stuff in cyber metal, it gives you all these hooks for feeling like you're either helping people or being part of the problem or just ignoring it. And so, different groups will take that in different directions, but at least it's there, it's present. It's you can kind of see the framework, you'll turn your head and see a political thing. And again, you could walk away from it. People be goofy. Sometimes people are in a weird mood, but I think that does come through definitely in that game. I think in your games in general, but that one is like screamingly like well done in that sense. So it's definitely, one of the reasons we wanted to have you on the show, because that's kind of the main thing that we always talk about, is like some sense of leftist politics and TTRPGs, right. And is there an intersection? What is that intersection? So
I was going to ask you if you've read any David Harvey, because that feels like such a.
I'm googling. I don't think so.
Or to follow on, like what are you into that?
Or like what's the influence there?
Yeah, I wrote a lot, so I'm sure this is a whole other thing that we'll talk about, but I am sort of in analysis mode, director's commentary mode for my newest game, Bloodborg, which is my 80s vampire punk take on Morkborg, the Swedish dark fantasy Goliath that everyone listening is going to already know.
I was going to say.
I like still give people the little like elevator pitch just in case, but everybody knows. Or at least if if you've heard of my games, you've heard of that game. But
that's a fair assumption.
Yeah. So I've been making like the commentary zine that goes with that on why did I do it this way and why is this piece here, and just mentioned specifically reading crime think zines and like radical like punk literature when I was in my 20s was like the big inspo there.
I forgot about how much crime think I read when I was in my 20s.
I'm still on the fence. So Crime Think actually has this like book, like very small, maybe 3x4 inch zine that is like a primer on anarchism. And I was like, how many of these could I get to feasibly put one in every copy of Bloodborg? Because they wrote it and they explain it in a way that's more eloquent and more polished than I could. But in my zine, I still mention like I read Evasion when I was 20, and then I thought about I just wanted to be that, like, and lived in squats and took bagels from the dumpsters, and we ate all that and like lived that lifestyle that we wanted, and just tried to like support our immediate community, which was the dozen or so friends of ours that were doing similar things. So yeah, that, and honestly, it's a little bit cringe now because culture has just changed, but going to hardcore shows when I was a teenager and having PETA be there and with the pamphlets and stuff, which again, like now PETA is a very different thing, but that was like a very formative radicalization for me, and like became vegetarian as a teenager and been vegan for 15 years. Like that culture of just introducing a teenager from Indiana to the concept of rejecting cultural norms was like, oh, like I didn't know. No one ever told me that I could just not subscribe to these norms. Or reading The Omnivore's Dilemma when I was in college, which was I can't remember the author's name. He
Michael Pollan?
Michael Pollan.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, that one really emphasized, like that one got me to go from vegetarian to vegan. And obviously being immersed in music culture and subculture, in DIY, punk and hardcore, that stuff was around, and it made it easier to find people who agreed and people who could encourage me to do those things, or facilitate, like when I first went vegan and learned how to cook things from other people. That's all to say that a lot of my push towards the left came from like early aughts anarchist and radical like outreach culture.
Yeah. I'm kind of like, I don't know if this is another thing. I don't know if you've read it or if you were into it, but do you remember Adbusters?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
In the early, I was like thinking, we were talking about maximalist design before we actually started recording, and I was like, oh, Adbusters. Like this makes so much, like looking at your books and then thinking about like flipping through those magazines. It's just like,
yeah, and layers of expressive
so
type.
Yeah.
And sort of
For
inverting
sure.
symbols, playing with symbol, and bold use of color. I mean, yeah, I think it's funny. I was influenced by that stuff, not as much Crime Think. Definitely Adbusters as just visual, at the time, like really before memes even, you could get a physical copy. I was more coming from like a Marxist Leninist tradition, like just reading like scientific socialism. But it's really funny you mentioned Omnivore's Dilemma, because I was dating a vegan woman for a long time after college, and I became a vegetarian because of that book. And before then I was like eating meat all the time, almost just to like fuck with my then partner, which seems like a thing you do when you're 20.
Sure.
But now I'm like, oh, that was whatever. So I definitely was very convinced, like from a scientific perspective, and just kept reading more and more, and have gone off the deep end with like sort of climate science. But it is interesting how these moments affect different people, and there are sort of waves culturally where these touchstones, these sort of discourses take hold, and that it has some then ripple effect with game design, which is obviously not like the point of left politics, but is something that on this show, like that's something Chris and I sort of probe, is like what are the things culturally that lead to sort of
it's a strange Venn diagram of game designer, or like especially like indie game designers, publisher, and like political radical, and why are those two things tied together?
Well, if you understand how you could think about like how to influence someone else. And I think that's one of the questions of game design, is like, what is game design for? So that's, sorry, not to cut you off, just like that's why I think there is a why there to some degree.
Yeah, and I think I co-host a game design podcast with my best friend Will called The Brain Trust, and we talk about this a lot, but the idea of just like writing what you know. And the thing that I know has just always been on the outskirts of culture and in subculture, from just playing music since I was 13 and making that my life, and then especially late teens, early 20s, doing DIY booking and DIY touring and that kind of counterculture microcosm. That's the lifestyle that I know. And now that I have I'm 36 now, more stable life, more kind of rooted in my local community, and it's just less evasion inspired, I guess, directly. But I get to both take that 20-year-old version of me and that 30-year-old version of me and put them in conversation at a table and say, like, I wrote about this a little bit too, that Bloodborg is a game about my 20s, where Cyber Metal is a game about my 30s. And Cyber Metal, that block to block community action, taking care of one another, is sort of my philosophy now. But the Bloodborg take on that is, I'm 24 and nothing can hurt me, and I'm going to live forever unless someone stabs me with a piece of silver or I see the sun. Like this idea of vampires as this false immortality, but like,
right,
they're considered immortal, but they have these glaring weaknesses, and that's very much like, that's just what being a punk in your 20s is like. Everything is
the glass cannon, like, I can drink 800 beers, but also like, I can't afford this car payment. Watch
me play Edward Scissorhand or Edward 40 Hands. I had an appointment that I missed. Yeah.
No, that's really great.
God, yeah.
Well, that also had brought up something earlier, which I do want to ask about, and how it all relates, which is sort of maximalist, expressionistic, expressive type driven visual design and graphic design specifically, and how does that play into whether it's from Adbusters or punk or hardcore posters or something else, and how does that play into game design? Is it ex post facto? Is it just like you write everything first and it's just black type on a white screen, and then later you do that stuff, or from the beginning you know what it looks like? Just like you're saying, you have these touchstones where like, this game is my 20s, this game is my 30s. Do they also look that way, or are all these sort of different threads, if you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Just because your games especially like really look visually very different, if that makes sense. They all seem to have this like whole like bananas world of design happening in the background somewhere.
There's very much a conscious thought of it's a chicken and egg. Like, does the visual style inform the design, and does the theme of the design inform the visual style? And the answer is yes, both ways. But so Cyber Metal is another great example, because Cyber Metal, the logo came early on, maybe not first, but like very early. That cover came really early. And for those who haven't seen it, it's like this really sketchy, inky, messy ink drawing of a goat's skull that has all these cyberware things built into it. But even the cyber implant, like, there's one of the horns is being held on like by a magnet, and you can see these little ripple waves or whatever, like implying this is how it's being held together. But there's also all these like analog aspects to it. There are tubes from a guitar amp that are built into it, and valves from like a trumpet built into it. So you can see the ways that you would interface with this thing are still tactile and analog. And I wanted that as this representative of, this is a cyberpunk game, and there's going to be like technology and shit, but it's not nanites. It's not this beyond our understanding of technology. It's something that you can touch and feel, and has some kind of thing that is familiar.
Yeah, it's the classic kind of Cronenbergy gooey sci-fi, where it's like things that shouldn't be going together, but here they are. Yeah.
And with that too, I wanted to illustrate that whole book with pen and ink. So it's all ink drawings on paper that are scanned in and colored digitally, but with Sharpies and pens that I made out of folded pop cans and dipped in black ink. Like, it's a mess, but it's like tangible. It feels like something. And I also did it as a response to this idea of like cyber and digital art, especially kind of like front wave of AI art. This is not just a person made this. This is a person made this with their hands, and it is like completely traditional media until it gets scanned in and all that. So that was, and then to kind of go more directly address the question, it does come from designing t-shirts, designing tour posters, designing album art. Like, that has been my thing forever, for longer than games. As the sort of visual artist in a band, you just end up doing all of it, especially like early years. It's crime of convenience. Your band doesn't have any money. You need a t-shirt, you need a tour poster. Oh, I'll just draw it, I'll paint it or whatever. I stole this CD of Photoshop from my high school so that I could crack it at home and use like Photoshop 6, like before Creative Cloud, Creative Suite, just old ass Photoshop. Learning that to put type on stuff and that sort of thing. But by doing that for years and years, having the band get more successful, which means more records, more t-shirts, more tour posters, I'm always sharpening this blade that is conveying information through graphic design. And with music, a lot of that time it's tonal, and I think that's obviously true of games too. So if I take something like cyber metal and say like I can pretty easily go, this is a game about, you know, living in a squat with a bunch of metal dorks, like easy. I can do that easy. Lots of black ink, lots of like high contrast, lots of scratchy, almost illegible type. That shit's a blast for me. But even in contrast, Necronautilus, that started with the logo, which is like kind of the sword or like psychedelic 70s style metal logo inspired. So it's symmetrical, but it's easier to read than like a death metal or a grindcore kind of typeface. And it has this curve
way easier
aspect. Yeah, right. And it has these curves that are supposed to sort of hammer home this like psychedelia theme.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of like kind of classic sword and sorcery books, like like Fritz Leiber, or even, you know, some of the Conan the Barbarian graphic design from the 70s and early 80s. That God, what's that artist's name? I'm gonna get you.
Brahm, maybe, as he jumps to mind. I don't know if he did any of the type, but there's.
I'm not thinking, it'll come to me later. It doesn't matter. But
it does have a very
era
classic
of fantasy.
Science
it's funny
fantasy
because
look.
That's such a major blind spot for me, because it was not something I ever engaged with growing up. But all the bands and movies that I like now were influenced by them. Yeah. So it's sort of this like weird trickle down of like, I learned science fantasy from listening to The Sword.
Yeah. Well, we actually have a question in the chat. Have you ever watched Listeners? It's a mecha show, but the mechs are guitar amps. That sounds cool.
I have not, but that sounds rad.
I haven't seen it, but I'm gonna start watching it later tonight, probably.
Gonna check it out. So it sounds like so a couple takeaways is, one, that you're doing a lot of what we might say in the ad biz, like fused concept, like you have in your mind kind of a whole idea, and then you're exploring that graphically at the same time that you're beginning to think about the rules and the tone of the writing, all that. And it also sounds like a lot of it is probably the same reason. I mean, you know, the way that I think of like the things I'm good at writing, it's because I also write for my boring day job, sort of science stuff. So then when I write science fiction, I'm still pretty good at describing science because it's what I do all day long. So it's like you're doing that, right, for your band, right? You're doing graphic design over and over again. So then when you want to do it for your games, like you have all those skills in addition to like Photoshop or whatever. You also like just know, okay, I know that font. I know how to hand draw this logo. Like you don't really have to like teach yourself again for each game because you're doing it already for the band for several years. So I think, I mean, that's like, not that everyone can immediately apply that, but it is a really important lesson of just like repetition, like 10,000 hours. You know what I mean? Like do the thing you want to get good at.
Very true. But also I think there's a thing Will and I talk about a lot too, is like taking that lived experience and putting it into your games. And like, that's why so many of my games have these subculture motifs, and like you are characters who live in a gutter or the sewer. And like you were saying, like going from formal science day job to science fiction hobby job, then that's like you know that you care about it, and that thing that you care about that care comes through in the way that you design and write things. And so I always tell people that like you have your thing. I think this is, and I'm sure this might be a segue, but that's why I've kind of like doubled down in the last year or two on horror games specifically. And that's why I want to engage with them mechanically and narratively, because like that is my absolute jam. That's what I spend every day thinking about. And like Chris said, I don't know, I think we were off air still, I just watch those movies every day.
Yeah,
So
it's spooky season all year.
It's spooky season all year. Now I'm just on 2-a-days instead of 1-a-days.
Yeah, I know. That's actually the difference. Is
Yeah.
It goes from like, I think for me it's like maybe like 2 or 3 pieces of horror media a week, and then it's like you get towards the end of August into September, and it's like, oh, we're at the everyday point, and then October is like, this is the only thing I'm consuming now.
Yeah, but I think everyone has that thing that in their life that they are super interested in and care about, and I think if you can find a bridge or create a bridge between that care of ingestion and that care of output, you'll end up with really unique and cool art.
And I think it applies to completely. It's like, I think of it as a kind of attention economy. Like if you can pay attention to it a certain way. I also think even if you're not the one doing it, right? Like, so for example, I'm not a great graphic designer. Chris is better than me. My wife is way better than me and does a lot of our stuff. But I do like care a lot about design and like read about it. And I feel like knowing what I want is a skill I've tried to work on while making games. And I wonder, maybe it's more natural if you're also the one doing the vast majority or all of that work. But it's like, I think any designer, you could begin to pay attention to like, well, even if I can't do it, like I know exactly. And I will just I changed into the shirt because it's the weirdest shirt that I found. It just says, kiss my bass, weird fish. And it's got a really scary bass on it. Anyway, I got it just because it was so fucking weird. And it made me laugh. And it made me feel like this is like a metal album fish shirt in Thailand that I, for like $1, it's just like, this is great. I don't know why I don't see this all the time. But I do think knowing what you like and having that sense of like, what is that part of your life you're expressing and what is your sort of ethos as a game designer is something that maybe seems non-intuitive, but might actually help and help like with decision making and, blah, 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 blah. I think there's something there. So with horror, you like horror, I take it.
Yeah. Let's talk about that.
Let's talk horror. In addition to, I could talk about cyber metal the entire time, but I do want to talk about another game, which is not the kind of game I usually play, because I tend to like games like cyber metal. There's a GM and there's players, and you're doing this kind of improv, maybe political thing. But 1978 is a 2-person game that you made with Logan Dean, who's a mutual friend, who basically made me buy it when I met you. But it's very fun. It's my wife and I played it, and it is super fun. It works really well. It's a card game where one of you has a deck. It's like a weird deck builder / location, builder router kind of game. Very simple. But one of you is the final girl type, the last character in the horror movie to live, and one of you is the slasher, the killer, the monster, whatever it is, right? And so it's an interesting kind of back and forth where in a way it's asymmetric because the killer isn't trying to kill the final girl up until the very end. And even then that's not like, I don't know, you should say more about it, but I found it very interesting conceptually. And I was curious how you made it, in part because it is kind of an RPG and it's kind of not like other RPGs. There's not a lot of 2-person games, and there's not a lot of games with this kind of asymmetry the entire way through, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. I've been thinking about this a lot lately, continuing this line of thought from 1978's inception, which was funny because just as a tangent, this was maybe a year and a half ago now that Blumhouse announced that the Blumhouse is a movie producer that does like kind of low budget horror stuff. They announced that they were doing a games division and that they meant video games. And Logan and I were on Twitter like, let us make Halloween. You have the Halloween movie. Let us do it. And then I DM Logan. I was like, damn, I can't stop thinking about what if we actually did it. And like, what if we had, at the time it was 2 separate. It was like, what if there's the Michael Myers game and there's the Laurie Strode game, and over iterating and stuff, it became one game, but it became competitive. And that is something I've been thinking about a lot in terms of like, so the way I think about horror in a games context is that I specifically don't enjoy the trad adventure game approach to horror storytelling, because I think that they are philosophically not in line with one another. That rolling a strength test to slam the door or whatever is not compelling, because that's not how horror characters think and act. And I think obviously when we're talking about role-playing games, all that we as players are thinking about is how our characters think and act. That's how we frame all the decisions that we make. So yeah, I just kind of bounce off the D20 plus stat take on that. I think, as we were talking about earlier, how I like to design bespoke systems to tell a certain story. I think horror is its own really wide umbrella, and the stories within it kind of necessitate their own unique spins on that story. So with 1978 specifically, we're talking again about Halloween. We're talking about classic slasher. It is very much a movie about these two, air quotes, people, Michael Myers and Laurie Strode. And there are plenty of other characters in it, and the town itself is effectively a character, and the culture of Halloween in this town is effectively a character. But at its root, it is Michael attacking whatever's in its way, and Laurie trying to stop that attack or survive that attack. And so I then look at it as a game designer. I go, okay, this is a 1 versus 1 situation. And rather than just being pure strategy game, like how do I beat you, I give both of these characters, in a role-playing sense, here's a couple different buttons you can push. And those buttons are like hide, attack, whatever. It's kind of like lean into the tropes of these movies, especially movies that have such a long history of trope building and trope subversion.
Yeah.
I think the slasher specifically, you mentioned, like, Michael Myers isn't necessarily trying to kill Laurie. It's more about kind of like the chase, the cat and mouse tension. And so we have in 1978, it's like instead of malice or blood or whatever, the resource that character collects and spends is fear, because he wants to instill fear in the other character. And Laurie's is resilience, because again, she just wants to survive. If she could kill Michael Myers, that would be a bonus, but her end goal is just getting through the night. So it became this really interesting thought experiment that spiraled into mechanical experiment that then became a published game. That is, how do these diametrically opposed characters with diametrically opposed goals interact with one another mechanically and narratively? And so the game has you doing that with cards, and like there's like an aspect of drafting and like knowing if I don't pick this card, then like the opponent might get it. So there's a little bit of strategy there, but every time you take a card, every time you play a card, you're adding narrative to the story that you're telling together. Because at its heart, it is a storytelling game that you can win or lose. But again, I go back way early in the conversation. I liken it to a game like Fiasco that is fun when your character ends up deep in the shit. And I love that game. I have based a lot of my game design philosophy on playthroughs of that game. But the number one takeaway I have is it is fun to watch people fail. And in horror, especially like a lot of horror movies, it's fun to watch people get killed. That's the fun of something like Scream. It's the kills, and then obviously the reveal, which is its own kind of sub thing. But
well, and then you even get movies like Final Destination, which is just
pure
the kills. Just the kills. I
Rococo level of stab.
I saw a funny thing the other day where it was like a theory video where somebody was talking about how in Final Destination the force that's killing all these people is not death. Like, death doesn't care. It's us. Like, we're like kind of twisted gods who are like watching this and like willing this into being. Because like if death wanted to take these people, he'd give them all a heart attack and then we'd be done with it. It'd be a 2-minute long movie. Anyway, whatever. It's funny, like talking about.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. I was just gonna say, talking about 1978, it is interesting because again, you have these like kind of tight parameters for genre and the story that you're trying to tell with each different game, right? And then that kind of defines the mechanics that go into it. And it seems to me like 1978 is more like, yes, it is competitive. Yes, somebody can win or lose, but it ultimately, like, it's in service of the homage to
Absolutely
the genre or to the thing. So it's like win or lose, you're having fun either way. It seems like.
Hopefully, but it's funny too because that game,
that's the goal.
That game does not translate to that sort of ensemble horror of something even like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which is, you know, the family versus the teens, because you have group dynamics in play. And I'm sure that there could be a 78 hack that accounts for that. But to me, that's a different game, and that's a different move. Like that movie has different design goals than Halloween. And so a game should reflect that. It's also funny because when I last saw you all, I hadn't seen it, but just recently I watched Funny Games.
Oh, nice.
Oh.
To go back to your comment, Chris, with Final Destination, like that movie, it was on my do not watch list for a long time because home invasion is too scary for me.
Yeah,
but
I get you.
It's a movie that specifically addresses the audience in it, and even has like breaks of the fourth wall to be like, why are you watching this? Or moments of extreme violence that are happening in the next room while the camera follows a character to go make a sandwich in the kitchen. And you have this moment as a viewer to go like, why aren't you showing me this? And then the movie says, you dirty pig.
Why do you want to watch it? Yeah. Why do you want to see that?
It's not a pleasurable watch in my experience, but it is like good in the way that all of Haneke's films are like well made, and it's like an art movie. You know, it's an art movie about why, you know, it's meta. It's why do we make horror movies? As you say, what is the Schadenfreude kind of about? Trying to get deep with that, and I think it has a lot of, you know, it's specifically about kind of modern horror and the horror of the home invasion of the middle class, you know, nuclear family. That like it's getting at a lot of specifics about media, you know, rewinding the scene. His other movies, I think, like Device Bond and like Cachet, like they get it. They're less, even though they're very evil, they're like easier to watch and more about like historic. You're like, yo, that's a thing that I also don't like Nazis. Great, yeah, fuck them. Right. Whereas Funny Games is like, whoa, that is just intense and awful. So I think it's interesting you bring that up, just because, like, as you say, each of these movies you could make a game out of, and I'm like, I don't want to play the Funny Games RPG.
Yeah, no,
you know?
I'd rather not.
This is my like not well kept secret is that I've made the Funny Games RPG. It's called Someone's in Your House, and I have it in like closed, like it's like an alpha version right now. It's a worker placement game. That's also a role-playing game. So it's in testing right now, and it's being passed around. I'll email you the.
I would play that. I mean, I know that we like just said that we wouldn't, but like I don't know. I want to check it out. Yeah, which again, like it's that thing. Like, why do you want to experience? Like, what's going on here?
And the game takes that, and I mean, like all of my games, and like most games that I play, takes the philosophy and themes of another medium and then allows it to be something that you interact with in a more active sense. So when Funny Games says like, why do you want to watch this scene? This game says like, why do you want to play a game where you're tormenting one another? But you are, and you're here, and here's the next here it's your turn.
You could refuse to play it, I guess.
But it's funny because it actually just kind of cuts to the quick in a way, because it's the same, like you could ask the same thing of Dungeons and Dragons, and many people have at this point, is like, okay, well, why do you want to play a game where you are essentially forced into the position of a murder hobo, or like, you know, anything like that? Like, why do we consume any media where violence, fantasy or otherwise, is kind of at the heart of it?
Totally.
Want
basically it's Dungeons and Dragons with no adventuring, with no beer, no levels. It's just the violent part.
It's from the perspective of the goblins. You run up in their home and torture them, and they're like, "Why? I just want to eat fish bones," or whatever. No, I have sort of building on all this, because I think we all have our own horror that we would most be interested in, and our own mechanics we're most maybe engaged in at the moment or whatever. But I mean, just looking through, because again, I played some of your games, I've bought some and not played them yet, and then some I've never heard of until I'm looking back at your store, because you've made so many damn games, Adam. So it's the same as Spencer. It's like, wow, I forgot that you made that one. But looking at them, so many of them are horror or some version thereof, or a hybrid with sci-fi or whatever.
Yeah, even Babes in the Woods.
Like how do you? So in a way, it's interesting because you're not doing like different genres every time, but it's also not the same thing every time. It's like this, again, iterative strategy, but it feels like, we were talking to Spencer about iterating around mechanics. It almost feels like you're iterating around types of horror and types of horrific or terrifying experience. I mean, does that feel true? Or like, how do you think about it in terms of like, like you said, okay, you're watching 3 horror movies a day and you're like, all right, I'm going to make a new game. This time it's, like, so, how do you sort of do that thought process? Is it all unconscious? Do you have a sort of like, Kanban board of like terrifying shit?
A lot of it is so I think a thing with horror heads too is looking for your line, looking for what can I no longer handle. And like I said, Funny Games was on that list for me for a long time. And then I watched it and I loved it, but I'm still not rushing out to go watch Martyrs or like kind of more extreme home invasion
more
stuff.
Extreme. Yeah.
So me being able to, in fiction and in play, explore things that I'm either scared of or like conceptually uncomfortable with is interesting. I think that's true of a lot of people, with even like the way Dungeons and Dragons has become role-playing in general. It's become a place where people can explore themselves through the safety net of fiction, whether that be gender and sexuality, whether that be philosophy, morality. And to me, with horror, I think philosophy comes into it, self-identity can come into it, especially with certain games like my game Ritual, which is a sort of Wicker Man or Midsummer type of folk horror. There are aspects of these questions of identity and self in horror. And so that to me is my like thematic iteration, is like trying to figure out what my deal is. Who am I as a person, as a game designer, as an artist? And the way that I can explore that is through these subgenres that say, like, again, Texas Chainsaw and Halloween are both slasher films ostensibly, but they have very different executions and goals and themes. And that's really fascinating to me, because there is still the like spirit Halloween culture of like fandom of these characters that I think is cool. And I think from a marketing standpoint of a person who publishes their own games, to say like you can be your own Michael Myers is a powerful thing. But I also really love, and got into this quite a bit when Logan and I were working on 78. It's like, who is Michael Myers? Why does he kill? Why do we cheer against him as fans of like horror versus someone like Freddy Krueger, who's got some riz, and like you end up kind of like you kind of cheer for him to kill, and more, and especially as those sequels go on and it becomes more campy.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that in both cases, and in most cases, you're both cheering for and against the killer at the same time, right?
Because you don't watch a horror movie to watch everyone survive.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I was thinking too. There's a moment in Psycho that's similar to what we were talking about earlier too, where when Norman Bates pushes the car into the mud pit, and the car kind of catches on something, and it's like sitting there, and there's this like moment of tension, and then you realize that you're like, oh, I'm self-identifying with the murderer in this movie,
right?
And there's always that kind of like weird positionality switching that's happening.
Mm-hmm. I think you're getting at something nice about genre fiction in general, and so it's interesting to hear you guys talk, because y'all are both real horror heads and I'm not. I could talk with the Coen brothers all night, sci-fi all night, but it's interesting because with all these genres, they allow us, as genre fiction nerds to see the cracks in well-told tales and to celebrate whatever we want in a given moment and sort of switch in and out of different types of joy of like experience. Because you can like root for the Schadenfreude of like kill that dumb, annoying character really dead. And then the final girl who has the Riz or, you know, whomever, you're like, you know, I don't want this person to die. I'm going to root for that person to escape the monster. And I think that ability to switch is just like, it's not something you can do in a well-told tale. You know, you need the protagonist. Like it's like harder to do, but with genre, you can always kind of turn to the camera, kind of like what Funny Games is acknowledging. Just be like, hey guys, it's just a movie. It might be fucked up, but let's think. You know, and I think D&D at its heart is kind of. It's always been weird how like in actual play, that's what happens. People just goof off and have moments of complete like, you know, oh, actually, we're gonna like be friends with these goblins. But the text is always so self-serious. And I think newer games, like kind of NSR games, have the ability to play with that a little and explore some of these other ways of playing as opposed to sort of the well-told, like you are a hero doing heroic shit. So anyway, I think it's interesting to hear y'all talk about horror. I did want to ask Chris. So Danse Macabre. So Chris makes a horror game that we're publishing that is super cool. And also it started as a 2-person game. I don't think you had played 1978 or we even knew that that existed a couple years ago.
No.
Maybe our loss, but I don't know if you had thoughts on horror or questions about horror for Adam, sort of specific from that, you know, design perspective. But.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's interesting with Danse Macabre, it did start off as a 2-person game, but it was always intended to be played kind of more like a traditional tabletop role-playing game. So there wasn't like the card aspect or any kind of like more board game kind of things, which I do think are nice to have when it's just 2 people. But that really, for me, that came out of like, so like, like the personal horror that I'm exploring in Danse Macabre is like, you know, thinking about suicidal ideation and just like, you know, the general fun, what's life after death kind of question, that just existential horror basically. And so like at first it was like, okay, well, this is kind of like an intimate thing and it feels like kind of weird to do this in a big group. And, you know, those were just kind of my own hang-ups. So I was like, okay, well, 1 GM, 1 player, and you can kind of like explore this together in a way that feels safe and kind of boxed in and whatever. But it's like the immediate feedback that I got on playtesting was just like, this was awesome. I wish I could do it with a group of people. I wish I could explore this with friends. So yeah, I'd moved into that direction from there. I mean, do you have any other games that are just 1 player or 2 player kind of thing? Is 1978 the first kind of foray into this more competitive
sort of?
Yeah.
Well, definitely. Well, I was gonna say it's definitely my first competitive game. It's not entirely true, but it's my first one that I think was realized. I had entertained that idea before to varying degrees of success, and I think I mentioned again Fiasco as my like idea here is like and Wythe, just out of curiosity, have you played it as a Coen Brothers fan?
Yeah, I would, and it's influenced me a lot. I will say it has a really, really interesting mechanic that I think I might have mentioned in the show, but I want to just reiterate. It has a mechanic where players decide one half of a narrative situation, and the sort of momentary, the sort of GM role, the director is like switching around, but the director decides the other. So you're deciding either the setup or the outcome, but not both. And for both parties, that's really pleasurable. And I've played a little with that mechanics in my games. I don't think the actual dice rolling works super well, I will say, but I think the just flipping of the rolls back and forth and collectively, you know, creating a noir works really. It's magical. It's a magical, fun game. If you haven't played it, go buy it, go play it. It's super fun.
I think my favorite thing about it, or the thing that I learned maybe the most from it, in addition to that mixture of narrative responsibility, is saying, here's all the characters. They all want something, and not everyone's going to get it. And that fucking rules. And that's the Coen Brothers thing too. Like, and that's why that system, I think, is good for that type of story. But it, again, is almost in opposition to the idea of like, when we all go into this dungeon together, we're all getting loot. And like, this game says one of you can have it and everyone else is going to have to like backstab each other and hope for scraps at best. And I think that's just narratively so much more fun for me as a player to just say like, yeah, we're not all getting what we want here as characters. So knowing that and setting that expectation early on is going to allow us to have fun with our failures and have fun with that journey. I think that's one of the core tenets of my horror design as well. Just saying, you're probably going to die. And when you do, it should be awesome. Because, again, a lot of the time when we watch horror movies, dying is like the most memorable part for a lot of these characters' arcs, if they have one at all.
That's very true.
So as long as
the pure spectacle of the moment
Yeah.
that defines an entire character.
Right. And as long as you go into it knowing that, I think you can still enjoy that and have fun playing that, because there is this preservation to a lot of traditional adventure gaming of like, I don't want my character to die because then I miss out on whatever other experience. So just making death part of that experience, you're good to go. Kind of, you just put a Band-Aid on it. You say like, well, like, don't be afraid of it. Like, have fun with it.
It's also a way to have real conversations around death, because, right, like you're
Yes.
saying, the atomized D&D experience in the Western tradition is, well, I'm just never going to die, right? I'm a temporary embarrassed millionaire who also is temporarily not immortal, but pretty soon I'll figure out a way to be immortal and I'll have a million GP. But I think in other traditions, if you look at like a lot of Japanese literature, it's all about how do people sort of spend their death, and it's usually for some sort of social purpose, right? It's for a communal purpose about the clan and sort of honor. And restoring, sort of balancing things socially, which is, I'm not saying I advocate for that and going back to being in medieval Japan. I'm just saying that is a way that people have viewed death and talked about death and made all their art kind of about dying. And the death moments are the story. But it's not for no reason or because everyone was like a lich, the necromancer. It's like because they were thinking about what is the purpose of life and kind of togetherness. And so those ultimate choices, the biggest choice you could ever make, would have that kind of meaning for everybody, as opposed to my atomized Conan the Barbarian analog, who's going to be, eventually a demigod. So I think if you're interested in like modern themes, sci-fi themes, dystopian, it makes sense that you'd want to lean more into that kind of noir tradition. People are going to die, they're going to fuck up. The Coen brothers, I never thought of them as horror until this conversation, but you could almost view a lot of their work as like
a lot of their
weird
work.
Yeah.
I would argue that a lot of their work is horror in like a weird, banal, existential way for a lot of it. Like, I think Fargo is definitely the movie and the series, afterwards that is like, oh no, that's a fucking horror movie. Like, they're chopping a dude up in a wood chipper. That's not... that's horror.
Yeah, touche. It's it's after 8, Adam, but I could talk all night, so just checking in on time.
Yeah, we should be mindful of our time.
Yeah, I also could go on forever, but I also know that dinner's coming up in the other room.
For sure.
But I would say, just as a pin in that last question, is I think setting player expectation is my number one advice for horror playing or design, because and this comes in especially like going back to someone's in your house, like, this is a game about violence. Here are the safety tools, because you are going to need them, but also by engaging with them, you get to be more violent in specific ways and lean into the themes of this game more with a little bit of a cushion of knowing like what is and is not explicitly off limits. So I think just expectation design has been something that I really, not even just with horror, but specifically there, think is really important. Page one kind of shit of like, if this is a game where you're talking about suicidal ideation, yes, that is a like trigger warning, but also like, here is, that's just like something that I want to be able to talk about and I want to be able to explore. And so, just making it safe and comfortable for those conversations to happen, whether they be in fiction or they spiral from the fiction. Because I think too, especially what we were talking about earlier with like political ideology, like, I don't know if this has happened to you, but if you're in a game and a character like kills a teenager or a kid or something, and then you're like, all of a sudden we're talking about like real life morality at the table. Like, we're not playing Dungeons and Dragons anymore. We're having an ethical debate. And I think that's really compelling and really interesting. And I think that's a testament to
Yeah.
some of the powers that these games can have, but also just like the connectivity of a group of people doing something together, which is really cool, and probably why most of us play games to begin with.
I was going to say, I feel like for me, that's the through line when we were talking about the Venn diagram of like left politic and tabletop gaming earlier. For me, that's always the through line, is that there's a kind of baked in communal aspect to it. And whether you're playing, grognard stuff, or if you're playing something that's like pure storytelling game, or like The Quiet Year or something like that, like you are still building something together, which I feel like is kind of the goal.
It's also a distance, and it's a distance that's purposeful. So you can have those, whether it's self-aggrandizing 12-year-old pretending to be Arnold, pretending to be Conan, not knowing who Conan was or anything, but just running around shirtless with a sword, and Dino Diller just being like, "It's good." Oh yeah. I mean, that's one way to do it. Another way is have these moments where you can have discussions around violence that affects children, or just death and dying, or suicide or whatever, these difficult topics, that in different ways, all adults eventually, you're going to have, thoughts about it, and it might be hard to talk to your friends otherwise. So games do provide kind of a safe mechanism, can be safe, could also be messed up. And Vex has some notes in the chat, tone setting tools are underrated, as well as de-rolling. I'd actually like to know more about de-rolling. I'm going to ask Vex about that after. But yeah, I think a lot of your games, Adam, get at some really fun, using horror, get at moments of real, things in life, through all these different mechanics and different fun ways. So 1978 is different from cyber metal, which has, themes of, metal and Satanism and stuff that I also really just enjoy reading and writing about. But yeah, I appreciate you sharing your time with us and sharing some of your design process. I wanted
Thanks so much for having me. I had a great time.
Give you the last word. Chris, before we send it back to Adam, do you have any last questions, thoughts?
Last question that I have is, where can we find all of the stuff that World Champ Game Co. puts out there? And I mean, I know that your most recent project just wrapped on Kickstarter. You're going to print soon, but how can folks find that, support it? Bloodborg.
So worldchamp.io is my website, where I have a web store where you can get almost everything I've ever made in print. That is my preferred method of engaging with my stuff, to hold it and to have a tactile response, and to feel that this also obviously coming from like record collector culture and music and all that. So worldchamp.io is my website with my store. There's also an email newsletter, so you can find out when new stuff is coming out. And Bloodborg, my 80s vampiric punk RPG, is coming out imminently. You can pre-order it right now at bloodborg.com, along with all the like Kickstarter bonuses and stuff from the campaign that are really awesome and beautiful, and have been trickling in through the mail, like hypodermic ballpoint pens and like sticker pack, but also like the director's commentary zine. I got an adventure zine, a solo rule zine. Like all this stuff comes together in a biohazard bag that you can add on to your pledge. So bloodborg.com is where to get that game.
That's fantastic.
Excellent. And worldchamp.io, right, has even more vassitude, vastness. What's your preferred proper adjective for whatever form of
I don't know that I've ever used one.
You heard it here first. While we roll, we're recording.
Well, I think you just made it up, Wythe. Yeah.
There you go.
Will say Vassinian. He'll describe things as Vassinian. Specifically arches. Like I use them in a lot of like one of the first pages of Necronautilus is an arch with a skull behind it, and so yeah, will send me photos of Vassinian arches that they find in the wild.
It sounds legit when you say it that way. It definitely sounds.
It sounds academic. I'm convinced.
Well, Adam, it's really a joy to talk to you, and thank you for making our entry into Spooktober, spook season, appropriately horrific and bloody and full of just weird, cool stuff. There's always more to say. Maybe we can have you back on, and/or if you ever want to talk on your show, which I just found out about right before we started taping. I was like, oh shit, Adam has a podcast, so we got to listen to it. So it looks great. But I'm sorry, I just didn't know.
Oh yeah, that's okay. I think it's a very your favorite game designer knows, but like it's not a very we're not very good at public facing.
I don't know that we are either, so we'll find out.
Yeah,
But
sure.
yeah, no, it's great talking to you. So that's
We're
it.
all fine.
Likewise, thank you.
Have an awesome dinner, and yeah, thank you everyone. Brain Trust, Vex, everyone who's checking us out in the chat. And this is Why We Roll with Chris Pickett, Adam Vass, our special guest, and I'm Wythe. I'm going to click end stream.
Night, everybody.